of this decision is very interesting. The rules in the Paris Agreement give a time delay for any country that wants to withdraw. Some very smart people developed the Paris Agreement and wanted to make sure that an administration in any country that came in couldn't, on a dime, tank this agreement that so many other countries had worked hard to secure. So there's a 1-year notification period and then a 3-year delay before the withdrawal kicks in. As luck would have it, the date that this would kick in for the United States is the day after the next presidential election. I'll just leave that there. Okay, process and outcomes. So this is a case where the president argued that this was a process issue, right? He said, we didn't negotiate well. We were taken advantage of. We got a bad deal. So he's making process arguments. But as I think I've already said, it doesn't really hold up under the evidence. And in fact, this is largely an ideological debate. It has very little to do with either process or outcomes, in my view. Okay, moving on. National monuments. It's our second issue. So, briefly, what are national monuments? They're a little bit like national parks. You can think of them as national parks light. A president can declare a national monument through the use of the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act is from 1916, so it's over 100 years old. But presidents from both sides of the aisle have used the Antiquities Act over those 100 years regularly, bipartisan. And every time they do it, everyone freaks out and says, the president used a little-known act from 100 years ago, and it makes headlines, and everyone gets crazy and starts Googling what is the Antiquities Act. But everybody does it. Every president does it, and they usually do it in the waning days of their administration because it's always controversial. But the president has the authority to set aside specific locations to protect cultural, archaeological, or historic artifacts. Many of those national monuments go on to become national parks, but that requires an act of Congress. Okay? But the use of the Antiquities Act is reserved for the executive. It gives the executive the authority. That's all the Antiquities Act does, is give an authority. The Antiquities Act itself does not protect anything. The Antiquities Act gives the president the authority to use it to protect identified areas on the landscape. So what's new and different here is that when President Trump came in and ordered a review of a couple of dozen monuments, some of which, by the way, had been protected by President Bush. So he was mostly looking at monuments protected by Clinton and by Obama, but there were, I think, 4 or 5 that were protected under the Bush administration that also fell on Trump's sort of hit list. Review these monuments and consider redrawing the boundaries. Now, as soon as he did that, this was an executive order, right? So there he is holding up the thing. He's holding up the executive order saying, review. It's just a call to a review. And legal scholars started scrambling because this was unprecedented. There's not enough legal history to know if he has the authority to shrink the borders. The Antiquities Act gives him the power to declare an area, but there's no precedent for shrinking it later. So we're in uncharted legal territory, and this is being reviewed now, legally. Just to drive the point home, this is one of the areas that was preserved. This is the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in very remote Utah that Clinton protected. Very controversial. It is an enormous area, and so he has been accused of overreach, of using the Antiquities Act to protect far more land than is justified. And these are the 2 that he has now proposed to shrink the border. So he called for a review of 20-something different monuments, and then came out and picked 2 monuments, 2 of the biggest and most controversial monuments, both in Utah, and proposed these shrunk borders, as you can see here. The Bears Ears Monument, he's proposing to shrink by 83%, so really dramatically. And the Grand Staircase Escalante shrunk just about in half, 47% shrunk, proposed. So let's apply our three lenses to this problem. The first environmental justice issue is particularly poignant when we look at the Bears Ears National Monument, because that monument was protected by and for Native tribes in the area. And in fact, it was on tap to be an innovative co-management model with tribal entities helping to manage the area with federal land management agencies. So it was really breaking new ground on land that has been contested for centuries by tribes in the West. So the environmental justice issues there, I think, are stark, that this is one area of two in the whole country that has been targeted now for a major reduction. And I think there's a hit also to community trust in general. A lot of community work goes into all of the monument boundaries, and communities meet and work and put a lot of trust in the process. And so this puts a cloud, I think, over that process. I think the durability question's in the hands of the courts right now, and I am eagerly waiting to see if presidents are allowed to shrink borders. We may see a lot of changes to national monuments going forward, because my guess is this is not the only president that has concerns about monuments. So I want to talk very briefly about this, because I am aware that we are short on time, and I want to make sure we have time to talk about the EPA, because that part's fun too. But when it comes to process and outcomes, I'm again going to do a little bit of myth busting, because just like the Paris Agreement, you know, we got out negotiated. I think that's mythology. It's not true. Similarly, here, what you hear, the rhetoric is these monuments were imposed. They are executive overreach. In fact, all national monuments, even though they are declared by a presidential act, have gone through a lot of community process. They're almost all grassroots efforts that go through many, many years of planning and map drawing and meetings and blood, sweat, and tears into proposing these areas, defending them, walking the boundaries, and justifying them. And it is not true to say that as soon as the national monuments were declared, no more mining could take place. That's what you hear coming out of Washington. It is flatly not true. Most monuments, these included, grandfather in existing leases. So if you are a mining company and you have a lease to a mining claim within an area that is later declared a monument, odds are, and in this case it's true, your lease is still good. What can't happen when there's a monument is new leases will not be granted, but old leases are honored. So that's a really important piece to keep in mind. It's not closing mining companies. Any existing claims are still legitimate, even in a new monument designation. And it's worth noting, especially when it comes to Grand Staircase Escalante, that market forces are the predominant limitation in terms of extractive industries. It's so remote, the transportation costs are so excessive that extractive industries have had open access to that area for 150 years, and very few claims have been made because the economics don't add up. It's not because of a federal law, it's because there's no money to be made there. Now that the monument boundaries have come up, there's still no new claims. So we're waiting to see. But again, in the end, I think this issue, when we're looking at process and outcomes, we're again in an ideological battle more than we are in a substantive debate. Okay. EPA. So very quickly, the EPA's job is to regulate. It's a regulating agency. So sometimes people say, I wish the EPA would stop regulating so much, but that's what they're there for. That's their job, is a regulation, to create regulations. So The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act are created, the Environmental Protection Agency was created as a part of this wave of environmental legislation specifically to enact regulations to comply with the statutes, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, by incorporating science and building and updating regulations to enact the law. That's their job. They even have an environmental justice division within the EPA because they are so attentive to that issue in the way they regulate. So what's happened under the Trump administration? A lot of things have happened. The size, the scope, and the role of the EPA have been targeted in a variety of ways, and I'm going to show you a couple of slides on that. So if you are a frequent visitor to the EPA website, you will pretty easily come across this. And this is what happens when you Google climate change EPA or related searches. So the entire website of the EPA has been revamped. Now it's worth noting that any new administration, when it comes in, will revamp web pages, will revamp promotional materials and outreach to put their own face on it. This is the federal government, and a new administration wants it to be theirs. So I'm being careful not to overstate this, but the changes have been pretty dramatic. Links to the White House have been taken down. Many pages were taken down entirely. References to federal plans on climate change have been removed. And any mention of international cooperation is nowhere to be found. Now, luckily in this country, we have some pretty wily scientists who saw this coming and archived everything. So nothing is lost, but the effort is there. And for most of us who would struggle to find those archived versions, this face of the EPA is dramatically different than what it was a year and a half ago, where it was really, as a professor of environmental policy, this was a main source of information for me. And it isn't anymore. This isn't anymore where I would go to get the most recent data and scientific information on US environmental policy is no longer here. I have to go somewhere else for it. That's pretty interesting. So here's another way in which the EPA has been targeted and changed. This just shows changes in the budget. And the EPA's budget is on track. The staffing at the EPA is on track to be reduced by half by the end of this year. Half. So there are lots of positions that are empty. They're not firing people. They're losing people by attrition and by not rehiring and by buyouts. But the agency is 50% staffed. So that's a pretty dramatic difference. And this budget also shows us a lot about enforcement. So let me show you something even more about enforcement. So this is the EPA enforcement scorecard. This is out of the New York Times. It shows differences in enforcement patterns. Certainly you can see, in the size of the cases anyway, you can see a partisan shift, but in the number of cases, Bush and Obama, not that different. It hasn't historically been a partisan issue to enforce the law, but we're seeing a big change now. Certainly with environmental justice ramifications. So, changes to the EPA. So, what happens when the EPA steps back and doesn't have the money or the resources or the staffing to have the reach that it has had historically is that those responsibilities fall to states. The EPA has always worked very closely with states. It's set up in a federalist model, so the EPA will set standards that are considered the floor, and then states can go above those. They devolve a lot of the responsibilities to states, so states have a really key role anyway in implementing environmental policy through the EPA. When it comes to enforcement, when the EPA steps back, states have to step in. The problem with that, as we know, is states have different levels of capacity and different levels of political will to do that. So we get wildly different enforcement across states. That's why we end up with something like Flint, right? That happened before Trump came into office, but it shows us really starkly how localized capacity can manifest in these huge environmental justice problems that we see. In terms of durability, the good news is most of these changes are administrative. Nothing has happened at the statutory level. There's no law that's been passed. These are regulatory changes and they're administrative changes. So they're staffing decisions, they're enforcement decisions, they're implementation decisions that are pretty quickly undone should a future president want to change course. There are processes of regulatory review. It doesn't happen overnight, which is also a buffer on this end. It takes a while for some of this stuff to go into effect. So this one's about both process and outcomes. We have the process certainly has devolved from a federal authority to state authority with wildly different levels of capacity and therefore different outcomes. But this one is also about outcomes. When we have less enforcement, we have more cheating polluters. That's how the world works. And when we have more cheating polluters, we have more pollution, we have more fossil fuels, we have more emissions. And this is administration that very clearly is on the side of industry, has said so, and these policies reflect that. So I'm almost done, and we'll have time for some questions. So here are some themes, I think, that come out of this review of environmental policy in the first year of the Trump administration. We see themes of policy devolution. It goes from the federal down to the states. And we see that across the board in all of the examples I gave. We see the federal government stepping back, and we see states, municipalities, private sector, communities stepping up to fill the void. So that's thematic. We also see disproportionate impacts. These changes are not going to affect every American equally. They will be disproportionate, and we will see patterns of environmental injustice across the country. We're starting to see that already. We're seeing governance norms be reshaped. People's expectations of what the role of the federal government is changing. What we can expect from our federal government in terms of environmental policy and environmental protection is shifting. We don't know how durable that will be, but that's thematic too across all of these issue areas. We have a new role for science, and we need to rethink about how science fits into policymaking. It's changing now. This administration is dealing with science differently than any previous administration. And we see that starkly in the three examples I gave. The United States is taking on a new role internationally in terms of environmental policy and certainly in other areas as well. But it has really ceded the leadership role, and other countries are jumping in to take that role. And sometimes I wonder if this isn't a big setup for the next president who's potentially now faced with coming into office and increasing regulations, increasing enforcement, doing all kinds of things that are awfully unpopular when they're done at such a huge scale across so many sectors and so rapidly. That's a tough world to come into as a new president. To right this ship, if the future administration wants to, will require some unpopular policymaking, even if we support those goals. So I'll leave you with that, and I'm happy to answer questions.
I'm gonna see if this mic works. I guess it does, and ask you if you have a question to speak into the mic.
So a point that you've been hitting pretty hard is how all these rollbacks take a very long time to go into effect. So how long does it take, what would it take for the next president to then undo these changes?
Some of them can be undone on day one, right? A new president could come in and say, we're back in the Paris Agreement. That's it, done, sign a paper. Some of them would also happen pretty rapidly. So many of the changes that have been made by executive order can be undone by a new executive order. Those can also happen on day one. Regulatory changes take a little bit longer. They have to go through a process. That's why it's taking so long for many of these proposed changes to actually go into effect, which is why I really urge you to be careful about freaking out about every headline you see. We have a very powerful institutional structure in this country. Our institutions are being tested by this administration, but in many senses they're holding up to that pressure, and it's taking a long time. We have judicial review happening. We have regulatory reform has to go through a process of time delay. So some of those, similarly, the flip side of that is we have to go back through that on the other side. But we have not yet seen any statutory changes. There hasn't been an environmental law passed yet. If we do see that, that will take a lot longer and be a lot harder to undo, but we haven't seen it yet.
So if you look at how most people, like what most people think about climate change, most people think it's a problem and recognize that it's a problem. They want to see the government do something about it. Why are we electing people who won't do anything about it? I just don't get it. I realize that's a naive question. I'm sorry, I'm a biologist.
You know, it's a great question. I probably don't have the time. That's a little beyond the scope. Why did this election happen? But I do think, you know, some of the seeds, the early part of my talk where I talked about sort of the context and the background of this, those strains, the anti-regulation piece of America, the distrustful of the federal government, I think helped to propel somebody who vowed to undo all of that. It's a much bigger question. There's a whole lot of scholarship going on out there to try to understand what has shifted in American culture and why this president was elected when he clearly stands for things that the majority of Americans don't agree with. It's a great political science problem. All my political science friends are tied in knots. Don't know what to make of it. Sorry, I don't have a good answer for that one.
Okay. So when you talk about the role of science, I automatically think about the relationship between science and religion this political season. And I'm wondering, what would it take for science to embody a role where it was nonpartisan and people from all political spectrums could connect to it?
It's a great question. I don't know that I have an answer for that one either. I was surprised, honestly, when I showed that graph that showed an ideological split in the trust in science going back decades. That was surprising to me when I started looking into that, because I think of that as being a newer phenomenon. And in my mind, part of the recent distrust for science is wrapped up in sort of antagonism toward elite higher education institutions that are seen as exclusive and excluding, being inaccessible for many Americans, many of whom support this administration. It has created a dynamic where we have people who feel that college is out of reach for them, that it's not accessible to them, that their communities and the people they know and trust haven't had that experience and they don't have access there. And science is part of that thing that is excluding them. And that, I think, has fueled some of the recent distrust and animosity. And it's gotten wrapped up in sort of the culture wars, unfortunately. It's my hope that a skilled leader could help to reframe that and resituate science so that it's not seen as exclusive, but is seen as accessible and woven into everything that we all do every day. But we need to hear that, and we're not hearing it now.
Could you talk about how the American West is distrustful of the federal government, and about specifically the Sagebrush Rebellion?
Yes. Again, I'm actually teaching a class on this right now. In New York City, I'm teaching a class on public lands in the American West, which is a lot of fun. It's a class I taught in Colorado for a long time, and teaching it in New York is a little bit different. But it gets to the root of that question, which is Western states have minimum 30% of their land base managed by the federal government, by the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management, mostly. So that land base creates all kinds of interesting challenges across the West, and politically and culturally, it has created communities where there's private land that can be completely surrounded by federally managed public land, and that creates a lot of animosity, a lot of conflict, a lot of distrust, and that's the roots of the Sagebrush Rebellion, is this revolt against the presence of the federal government in the West, because for some who live especially in the rural West, the federal government is right outside their door every day telling them what they can and cannot do on the landscape, and people really struggle with that and push back against the feds. I mean, when I used to give talks in the West, I always had to start with some good Fed bashing, or I could not get any attention. I mean, you really kind of have to start there, because there's a lot of resentment. People, ranchers, foresters, recreation users, people who want to use the public lands often feel that the federal government in Washington, D.C., people wearing suits who don't know anything about their lifestyle, is making decisions about the land that some believe should rightly be available to them. It's a great and complicated story, and you should come take my class.
Well, with that plug for your class, I'll thank you for taking our questions here, and thank the audience for attending. Hope to see you back in Grinnell sometime.
Thank you so much for staying up. Thank you. Oh, good. Thank you. Good. Thank you.
Is there any chance that you might be willing to share your slides
Sure.
with my class?
No
Because
problem.
I'm currently teaching an intro to peace and conflict studies class.
Aren't you biology professor?
I